Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'd like to share with you the second chapter of Barton Curry's Fishers of Books. As I've mentioned in my previous videos, this is a 1931 publication, a series of chapters, essays really, on book collecting, specifically his personal experiences with book collecting. And chapter 2 is quite a good one. I probably won't go through this entire book, but I am going to pick and choose a few chapters to share with you in videos like this, because I do immensely enjoy reading aloud, and I know from past experiences making videos of this nature that many of you also enjoy hearing me read aloud. I started 8 or 9 months ago to read a travel book aloud, but I guess I sort of abandoned that. But this I will follow through on, because it is something that I immensely enjoyed reading. So chapter 2 is called How Collectors Happen. Well, there must be several 100,000 buyers of rare books and manuscripts around the world. They are nevertheless regarded in all countries as a species of lunatic. They are separated from all other collectors as freaks. Coin collectors and stamp collectors are far more numerous than book collectors and far more understandable to most. Coins and stamps have at least the similitude of money. In the freshness of their days, they were money, and is it not natural for mortals to yearn for money, yearn to possess it, to handle it, and not infrequently to hoard it? But shabby old books and decaying fragments of manuscript present to the average man a wholly antithetical conception of money values. Only the sort of magic that appeals to a child or to an idiot could transform such tattered medallions into precious treasures. Defend the extravagances of the bibliomaniac with all the logic at your command. It makes but a puny impression. Point out that there is just as great a degree of abnormality in the passion to collect old furniture, old glass, old china, old carpets and tapestries, old Greek and Roman bathtubs, ancient suits of armor, swords, daggers, and war clubs, 17th century Italian garden junk, Renaissance wrought iron that is being imitated throughout Tuscany in scores of little factories and smitheries. All in vain. Practically every phase of book collecting the book maniac may name, except his own, has its roots in reason and sanity. All other collecting faddists are antiquarians, or archaeologists, or geologists, or something equally respectable, dignified, intelligent. There is, in most cases, a utilitarian value in what they scoop up and sweep up in their wanderings. You can sit on their furniture and eat off it if they will permit you to. Their china, glass, and pewter are usable, likewise ornamental. Although many of them pile their finds in stables, hide them away in attics, and keep on buying duplicates, their stuff is utilitarian nonetheless. Their children or their grandchildren can haul it out and have it restored. But what can anyone do with old books and disintegrating bits of manuscript? Not read them, certainly, when there are so many modern editions printed with much better type. Do not these book collectors who show their prizes to you watch you in agonized fear lest you drop one of the hopeless old relics or open it too far with a careless wrench of the wrist? Yes, the rare book collector is the madman of the lot. Curiously enough, the bibliophile rather rejoices in this verdict. Once he is in full gallop on his hobby, all the rest of the world is mad save him. Moreover, he feels a vast superiority to every other sort and genre of collector. In the tight little cosmos of the Fisher of Books, just one form of collecting is wholly admirable and understandable, namely the acquisition of rare books and manuscripts. The book collector has known many stamp and coin collectors, old furniture men, old glass and pewter men, who turn to books, but he has never known a first-grade bookman who got down off his hobby before the undertaker was sent for. It may be this unswerving devotion to a one-track hobby that gives the impression that the bibliomaniac is the supreme oddity of all. but our detractors are never sufficiently articulate in interpreting us to give us a clear-cut idea of their reactions. That feminine rejoinder, "just because," is the common answer of our interrogations. Occasionally we will hear an exposition that runs about as follows. Our instinct tells us that you rare book grubbers are the ultimate development in eccentricity, even though we are unable to reason it out. We can look at old pictures and old statuary, old furniture, old carpets, and old tapestry and see something of the past, feel genuinely thrilled and speculating on the older civilizations that produced them. There is always the understandable beauty of these objects, the trace of the great masters who produced them. But old books, generally speaking, what are they? The ones that appear to be the most valuable and the most sought after were produced by the worst printers and the worst scribes of our time. We can understand a little why Gutenberg Bibles, magnificently illuminated missals, and psalmsters, or the loveliest specimens of binding of the past 4 or 5 centuries are collected. We have a faint notion why great value should be accorded to specimens of handwriting of very great men. But when it comes to mere first editions, tattered and battered and disreputable remnants in themselves, we are utterly puzzled as to what makes them attractive or of consequence. I have endeavored to explain to at least 20 practical and intelligent men and women why I delighted in collecting such trash. Only an hour before beginning this paragraph, I sat chatting with Gertrude Atheron on the sheltered afterdeck of the Rotterdam as she glided out of the ancient harbor of Syracuse after a 6-week roundabout of Greece, Palestine, Egypt, Algiers, Morocco, Cyprus, Crete, and Malta. I mentioned to Mrs. Atherton that, to my mind, the greatest atrocity of all the Mediterranean was the destruction of the Alexandrian Library. Mrs. Atherton was not quite sure she agreed with me. She was inclined to think that the destruction of all the written words in the world might be rather a blessing than a disaster. "Consider what a boon it would be to the modern author," she chuckled. I mentioned to her then that I had bought a first edition of her book, The Conqueror, and that it was such a superfine copy that I had had a red morocco case made for it. "That strikes me as a trifle idiotic, although of course I am flattered," she commented. "I have met a good many book collectors in my time, and most of them have every outward appearance of intelligence. Really, none of you can be quite normal. You are all victims of some painless disease that is beyond the reach of medicine, surgery, or even metaphysics. I could understand paying a reasonable amount of money for a copy of Aeneid in Virgil's own handwriting, but as for my book, The Conqueror, that is past human comprehension. What is the first symptom of this malady when it attacks you?" "There I am stumped," I replied. "It happens to you, and you have it. You are unaware of its approach. The germ is even more cunning and stealthy than the love germ. With love, you have warnings and a tingling awareness, and the early symptoms are exalting. The first symptom of bibliomania, however, is much more subtle than love. It anesthetizes. It manifests itself by producing a form of somnambulance. Haven't seen that word before, so we'll skip that one. You come out of a bookshop carrying a first edition of something or other. You cannot explain how or why you got it or what you paid for it, but you have it. And when you arrive home with it, you creep off to some secluded room and examine it. Then occurs the first little burning exaltation. Just a little glow to begin with, then by infinite gradations, a consuming fire." "I imagined it was something like that," said Mrs. Atherton. "You have my sympathy." Since the dawn of culture, the bibliomaniac has been pillared by the uninitiated. Lucian, the last great master of Attic eloquence, the Attic wit, had neither sympathy nor pity for him and assailed him as follows. "You think that by purchasing a great number of fine books, you may be taken for a good scholar, but, on the contrary, you will only make your ignorance the more conspicuous. Not only do you buy the books which are not the best, but you are easily persuaded by the first man who praises the book, so that the booksellers who know you sacrifice to Mercury are as lucky as if they had found a treasure, for they would never hope for a better opportunity of converting their vilest trash into solid cash. even supposing that you were just discerning enough to buy the manuscripts of such a dealer as Calenus, so much admired for their elegance, or the publications of an Atticus, so celebrated on account of their accuracy. Of what good, my dear sir, is such a possession to you? You can no more appreciate their excellence than a blind lover the fine eyes and rosy cheeks of a charming mistress. You may have collected the works of Demosthenes, including one of the 8 copies of Thucydides, which he wrote with his own hand, or all the books which Sulla, when he made himself master of Athens, seized and sent to Italy. Yet how could that avail you? If you made your bed on the best copies of the great authors, or were decked in manuscripts head to foot, would you be less ignorant than you are? There is a proverb that says, an ape is still an ape, though adorned with jewels and gold. You men of wealth, would you have too many advantages over us poor scoundrels if you could buy in an instance for a mere sum of money all the store of learning which has taken us so long to collect? If that were so, no scholar would venture to contend with the booksellers, with the vast stores of learning in their possession. But on closer inspection you will find that these worthy persons are no less lacking in taste and discernment than yourself, though their days and nights are well spent among books. Today our critics are more moderate in their scorn than was the caustic Lucian. They have come to grant the fisher of books some sympathy and pity, very little admiration, and almost never any envy. With perfect futility I have raved about that subtle infusion of pleasure into my consciousness when I handled any first edition of a great book, provided always in my own special case that it is a book that has meant a great deal to me in my 40 years of reading. I have at least convinced myself that my efforts at collecting have been confined to only those works from which I have derived the greatest amount of enjoyment, or the greatest amount of good, as I recorded it as a reader. Robinson Crusoe I knew almost by heart at the age of 10, and I had succeeded in imagining myself in his place 1,000 times in those boyhood days when the real world became infinitely tiresome. My first edition of this imperishable romance was a great extravagance, but there is a renewed thrill in handling it every time I pick it up. Here is the very book that stirred the youth of 2 centuries ago, just as it fired my imagination within a comparatively brief span of my living memory. I showed my first edition Crusoe to Booth Tarkington on the day I lured him to the little alcove library, wherein my great prizes are wedged in double and triple rows. When I told Tarkington what I had paid for those 3 precious volumes, a fleeting look of pain shadowed his features, and the corners of his mouth contracted. In a man of such infinite kindness and gentleness of soul, such an expression was doubly eloquent. He pitied me to the bottom of that great heart of his. He had long had faith in my sanity, but now it was gone. Even though I had been at great pains to collect every first edition of his own works, and save every letter he had ever written to me, there was little his judgment could render in my favor after hearing what I had paid for my Robinson Crusoe, first wonderfully preserved and in the original calf binding. I strove to make it more understandable to him by pointing out its beautiful condition after 2 centuries of handling. I explained all the points by which it was distinguished from the second and later issues. Here in my enthusiasm, my voice rose to shrillness. It is a common delusion with a lot of us that noise is convincing. If you cannot score a point in a low, even tone, raise your voice, shout, scream. The result is, of course, the opposite of what you hope for. Soft-voiced lunatics can get away with almost anything in this trusting world of ours. But once let them begin shouting and gesturing, and they are led to the little room where they keep the straitjackets. Suddenly, sensing the folly of my tactics in my argument with Tarkington, I stopped my voice down to a husky whisper, put away the Robinson Crusoe, and pulled out an immaculate first edition in the blue binding of Huckleberry Finn. I told him that there were American firsts of this book in the green binding, almost as fine as my copy in blue, but that the blue cloth was so relatively scarce as to be practically unattainable. And I suppose this color variation would make at least a trifling difference in cost," sighed the gentleman from Indiana. "The blue cloth," I said casually, "makes a difference of about 300%. You could buy a prime green copy of Huckleberry Finn for about $200. A superlative copy in the blue binding would fetch in the neighborhood of 600. Tarkington's features stiffened with unbelief, but that quizzical smile soon reappeared, and he went on inscribing, writing comments, and making charming little sketches on the flyleaves of my first editions of his work. Though nothing I could say or do would provoke him to say so, I am sure that he obliged me in this way, as the kindest of men are wont to humor children. And so here we have his first edition of Robinson Crusoe in a lovely image here. Indeed, his generous pity for me expanded to such a degree that he gave me the entire holograph manuscript of his then latest book, The Plutocrat. It has often puzzled me why so few authors of distinction collect rare books and manuscripts. Bernard Shaw has been brutally frank in expressing his opinion that book collectors taken en masse are a harmless lot of morons bitten by an inferiority complex. Hugh Apple, John Drinkwater, Thomas Beer, Christopher Morley, and the late Amy Lowell are a few of the exceptions. E.V. Lucas, who has a much wider acquaintance with the literary great than I, was the only author to whom I put the question: why is it that authors do not collect rare books and manuscripts? Who gave me an articulate reply. The objectives of authors and a book collector, said Lucas, are as opposite as the objectives of undertakers and obstetricians. The book collectors want small first editions. The author rejoices in huge first editions. As both a publisher and writer of books, I can conceive of no more perfect state of society than one in which all first editions attained a minimum of 50,000 copies in actual sales within the aid of Book of the Month clubs. Authors and publishers would then be as doves to one another. 20% royalties would prevail, and haggling misunderstandings between publishers and authors would be so uncommon that it would be safe to assume they couldn't be. Now, in such a world of singing harmonies, there would be no book collectors, and all the Rosenbachs, Gabriel Welleses, Courtiches, and Walter Spencers would soon put up their shutters. The only way a first edition could become valuable would be for the author to write some scurrilous attack upon a great man of the times, or upon a brother author on the flyleaf of one of the 50,000 copies of his first edition. It is not likely that this would occur with sufficient frequency to keep the industry alive. Writers may be sentimentalists about some things, but not about first editions, nor yet about royalties. As they cannot, in any particular, see eye to eye with the book collector, they are naturally suspicious of him and annoyed by him. They are even opposed to this limited first edition craze that has gathered such impetus in the last few decades. They dislike autographing special editions and suspect that they are being done out of some of the profits by the publishers and dealers when they hear that a few of these autographed books published only yesterday are selling at premiums of £5 to £10. Can you blame them for being suspicious? As I diagnose book collectors and authors, I regard the author as a far more sane and worthy type. He is a creator and a practical man. The book collector preserves and hoards and rakes through rubbish heaps. The strangest thing about him is that before he developed his mania, he was likely to have been among the hardest and shrewdest of workers, a manufacturer, one of those men of mystery called capitalists, a banker now and then a lawyer or a physician. Only in the case of a banker is the development of such a hobby quite natural. The banker probably knows more about the fact of scarcity than men of other vocations. Nothing can become more acutely scarce and wanted than money. If the same thing can occur in old books and manuscripts, is it any wonder then that the banker is likely to become a gatherer? I have personal reason for being thankful to E.V. Lucas. Being thankful that E.V. Lucas has not the book collecting urge. In my Conrad collection are some presentation copies he sold to me at a time when exceptional Conrads could be had at modest prices. Likewise, I acquired from him at a great bargain the entire lot of large paper presentation Milne Shepherd books, 2 of them in the vellum editions that were limited to 20 signed copies. When we were very young came out in the large paper, inscribed by both author and artist at £2 shilling. Within 3 years, some dealers were asking £80 for it. Lucas let me have, at the publication price, the copy the author had presented to him, and for all the later ones, he asked only an insignificant premium. On the whole, it is better for collectors that authors keep out of the game. It would also be much better for collectors if some authors were much less liberal with their presentation copies, wrote fewer letters, numbered and dated all they did write. Take Bernard Shaw, for instance. He himself hasn't the ghost of an idea how many letters he has written. There must be tens of thousands of them. That is, if you count postcards. I saw one batch of postcards he wrote from the Riviera to a young lady who had a minor part in one of his plays, but who played this part to the author's great satisfaction. He sent her off 2 or 3 postcards a day. She kept a lot of them and later sold them en gros at a large price to a dealer who split them up and sold them in little lots at a trifling advance of 400 or 500%. As a bit of idle speculation, let us assume that Shaw made a practice of sending off reams of postcards to all the ladies who played in all his plays. If all of them were treasured, there must be a ton or so of these Shavian items lying about. Yet some Shaw letters have brought, and likely will bring again, as high as $1,000. Dickens was another letter writer of baffling fecundity, but fortunately Dickens never had a typewriter. Shaw has had one for about 15 years, and you never can tell when you buy one of his typewritten letters for a thumping big price, whether it is not some other collector hasn't the holograph original. You see, the innumerable ifs of collecting add immensely to the fascination of the game. Almost immediately you are smitten with the mania, and you are enchanted by the uncertainties you have let yourself in for. You are keen to get to the bottom of all its mysteries. You flatter yourself that you are sharper than the majority of dubs who are collecting. Your one great and lasting regret is that you failed to start at it earlier in life. Say 20 or 30 years before you made your first plunge. You can scan through a bundle of old catalogues and weep at the prices there recorded. A first edition of Scott's Waverley and the original boards, with labels intact, for 10 shillings. Today you would gladly pay £1,000 for it, if you could find it. But so would a dealer, and if he has got hold of one, what would you have to pay? A fortune if the quotations are running wild in Wall Street. It is of small consolation to tell yourself that you could not have begun to be a real collector much before you did, because you didn't have the money to spend. Besides, you were too busy. Your boss had an eye of steel and a heart of stone, and you feared the reputation of being odd. Rather futile excuses, all of these, after you have met several collectors who were in precisely the same fix as you were at the same time, but who had the miraculous good judgment to buy all of Thomas Hardy's first editions, fresh from the publisher, and then send them on to Hardy himself to have him write historic comments in them. I have seen a Desperate Remedies which was acquired in this way, at a cost of about $10, including postage. Even at the bottom of a bear market in this decade, it should bring at least $5,000. Just spend a day or 2 in A. Edward Newton's library and learn what he did with his money at a time when you thought you were miserably poor. With ridiculous ease, you could have spent no more than he did on hundreds of little treasures that have now scaled up in price from 100 to 5,000%. No, once you are bitten, you will never fail to groan at the thought that you were not born and bred a collector, that you neglected as a child to hoard your allowance of 25 cents a week for the purchase of the first editions of Edgar Allan Poe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Rollo books, Alice in Wonderland, Tom Sawyer, Little Women, Moby Dick, The Scarlet Letter, Walden, or anything else of the sort that could have been bought for shillings in your boyhood days. True enough, it is not given to many collectors to guess with unerring certainty concerning the permanent values of contemporary authors. There is too great a divergence of opinion among those whose judgment you are likely to be swayed as to who is or who is not permanently placed in the world of literature. Take Conrad today as a notable example. Men like John Galsworthy, H.M. Tomlinson, E.V. Lucas, Bernard Shaw, J.B. Priestley, and Christopher Morley swear by him. I began collecting him almost from the very first, and got a greater thrill in reading him than I had ever from those like Dickens or Thackeray. I acquired 9 of his most important manuscripts, the manuscripts of Victory, Typhoon, and Falk. Among them, I stocked up with presentation copies and letters. I filled shelf after shelf with Conrad's, and then I invited Eddie Newton to come see them. I watched A. Edward's face for the light of enthusiasm. That genial countenance registered blank. Newton was about as cold to Conrad as ever the Vatican was to Luther and George Borrow. The great Pole's mysticism and his utter absence of a sense of humor made it impossible for Newton to enjoy a page of Conrad's amazing prose. I recall also that Chauncey Brewster's Tinker reacted in almost identically the same manner. He spent hours poring over Richardson's, Fielding's, Smollett's, and the Sterns, likewise my Jane Austens, but never reached his hand in the direction of the Conrad shelves. There also came to this same little room of mine where my best beloveds are stored, Morris L. Parrish of Dormy House, Pine Valley, New Jersey, whose collections of Bronte, Lewis Carroll, Hardy, Scott, Meredith, George Eliot, Stevenson, Barrie, Anthony Trollope, and Wilkie Collins cause rivals to throw up their hands. Parrish is far from a one-track specialist. Indeed, he has the magnificent lot of all the Victorian novelists. Also, he reads what he likes and likes what he likes, but not Conrad. He is as frigidly aloof from the Conrad shelves as either Newton or Tinker. Here were 3 men of infinitely greater collecting experience than I, who were as one thawless glacier when it came to Joseph Conrad. And there were many others to whom I talked who felt precisely the same way. What is a youngish collector, and a fairly green one, to do in such case? Chuck his Conrad and take on someone else for whom he personally cares much less? Herman Melville, for instance? 9 out of 10 of my collector friends were keen about Melville. Several of them called Moby Dick the great American novel, though it is really no more of a novel than is Robinson Crusoe. And what child or adolescent has ever been able to read so much of a chapter of it? But somehow I could not rave about Moby Dick, American classic of the sea though it may be. I had read it 3 times, trying to step up my enthusiasm. I paid $1,000 for a very fine first edition of it, and again read it in its pristine form. But no, Conrad for me 10-1 against Herman Melville. I did not abandon Conrad, nor was I influenced to go on with Melville, save to this extent. I bought another first edition of Moby Dick because it was even finer than the one I had, and somewhat cheaper. Also, I obtained from Dr. Rosenbach a very splendid copy of the first English edition, in which the title is changed to The Whale. This English edition, dated the same year, 1851, comes in 3 volumes instead of 1, and is said to be much scarcer than the American edition. Said to be scarcer should be italicized for all collectors. In the majority of cases, there are no publisher's record of any kind. It will take years of looking on your own to size up degrees of scarcity, and then you may be wrong. Sudden demand can create a great apparent scarcity. Take Boswell's Life of Johnson as an example. There are hundreds, possibly thousands of them. 10 years ago, there were heaps of them in the shops of scores of booksellers. Now you may look all day in London or New York and find only 1 or 2, unless you go to Rosenbach. He has a shelf of them in the original boards, but the Rosenbach copies are all exceptionally fine, most of them in the uncut state. Naturally, they are priced accordingly. Boswell's Johnson is a book that has leaped in price from a few pounds to 1,000, not because of scarcity, but through sheer popularity and demand. Why all these furor for Boswell's Johnson when distinguished critics have been writing him down for a century? But consult the works of Chauncey Tinker and A. Edward Newton. Think of the thousands who read their books, listen to their lectures, and abide by their suggestions. And do the dealers quote Newton and stock up with his favorites? They most emphatically do. They stock them up and they price them up, which sentence is intended to be eloquent rather than rhetorical. But let us get back to the British edition of Melville's The Whale. It is alleged to be very scarce, and appears to be, for you will not find the British dealers turning up a good copy once a year. The chance to obtain a very good copy of The Whale from Rosenbach's Paladin New York bookshop on 51st Street near Fifth Avenue at less than half the usual price for a Moby Dick proved too tempting for me to resist. Now, having 2 American firsts and 1 British first, all fine, I ought to join in the chorus and proclaim it among the preeminent books. Whether or no, it is hard labor for me to read it. But I shall never be brought to admit that it is as good a book as any one of 5 of Conrad's, nor will my critical sense, if I have any, allow that it is as good a book as Tomlinson's The Sea and the Jungle. I shall stick by Conrad and hang on to his book so long as I possess the means. No collector who is not a Croesus is safe in saying that he will never sell anything, not in these perilous days of great upswings and downswings of stock quotations. The book collecting mania has been known to peter out in old age. Some men have been talked out of it by their dominant wives, who could hardly be blamed for preferring a Rolls Royce or two, or a page of Robert to a page of Robert Burns' manuscript. And there are collectors who go broke, busted bibliophiles, as Newton has alliterated. It may be apposite to admit that I owe much to Dr. Rosenbach for my resistance to the influences of those who are utterly cold to Conrad. More than half of my Conrad manuscripts came from the doctor, who bought them wholesale at the Quin sale. But he would not sell me the manuscript I desired most of all. Neither would he sell me the manuscripts of Lord Jim and Elmer's Folly. No, not even had I paid him a small fortune for the manuscripts of Victory, Typhoon, and Falk. He is the only dealer to whom I ever pleaded in vain to be allowed to commit great extravagance. Nor did I subside after my first try. I pegged away at him for more than 2 years before finally giving up. He had taken the manuscripts to his home on Delancey Street, Philadelphia, where they would remain permanently out of the market, and his goody two-shoes, his Cervantes letters, and many other treasures that excite the covetous of every collector who is allowed to see them. There may be other dealers who feel this way about some of their most precious items, but I have yet to meet them. True, there are none so opulent as Rosenbach, yet it is fairly certain that there are many with ample wealth to collect on their own and withdraw certain prizes from the market if the spirit moves them. The great French dealer, Edouard Reher, was a noteworthy exception who built up a home collection that he walled off from commercial contacts. Unfortunately for me, I never met Reher. He died in 1924, and until recently had only a misty idea of his fame and worth. In May 1930, when I happened to be in Paris, and when all the stock exchanges of the world were in the dumps following the autumn cataclysm of 1929, a part of his private reserve was sold at auction for his widow. There were 250 items in this sale, including Maoili and Grolier bindings, and many superlative examples of 16th, 17th, and 18th century illustrated books. Fine bindings, first love of the continental collector, predominated, but the choicest of the illustrated books brought the spectacular prices. In 3 days, the Reher holdouts were sold for the equivalent of more than $500,000, plus a government tax of 14%. This was an all-time record for 3-day book auctions, and it showed that even worldwide economic depression does not affect the sale value of rare books that deserve AAA ratings. The high spots of the Reher sale were 3 1511 Derriere folios containing 45 wood engravings by the great Nuremberger, which brought 440,000 francs, 3 volumes containing 622 examples of Watteau on 272 plates, which brought 410,000 francs, Voltaire's La Pucelle d'Orleans, with 20 original drawings of Gravelot, 365,000 francs, a 1555 translation into French of Xenophon, which was bound for Catherine de' Medici and bore her coat of arms, 322,000 francs, Les Métamorphoses d'Ovide, Paris, 1767 to 1770, 4 volumes with 140 illustrations by Boucher Eisen, Gravelot, and J.M. Moreau, and also 30 vignettes by Chauffard, 325,000 francs, a 1734 edition of Molière, 6 volumes in 4, illustrated by Boucher, 205,000 francs, a 4-volume Orlando Furioso in a superb 18th century binding and containing 46 illustrations by Moreau, 200,000 francs. To all these prices, a 14% tax must be added. If you were a continental collector placing your bid through a dealer, add another 10% to that. And if you happen to be an American collector placing your bid through an American dealer, who in turn placed his bid through a Parisian deal, add still another 10%. Taking the extreme hypothesis in this bit of conjecture, the durier laid down at his library door would have cost the American collector nearly to a penny, $23,600. Well, there were no hysterical peak prices in this Paris auction, such as occurred at the Curran sale. The bidding was nevertheless high enough to establish new records both for France and the entire book world. The 250 items sold represented only 1/3 of the treasures, which dealer Rehere withdrew from the market and shut away in his home library. According to some of his rivals, the profit above what he had paid for these books was enormous, demonstrating his excellent good judgment in hoarding. Rehere was a power in the book world, a generation before Dr. Rosenbach emerged on his meteoric career. There is nevertheless a close similarity in the genius of these two. And here's editions of Huckleberry Finn and some Jane Austen right here on page 39. Both developed an uncanny faculty for nosing out the items that the great collectors would compete for. Both were able to win the reputation of scholars and command the respect of other scholars, and then capitalize this reputation in their business. And what was finally and supremely important, both were able to outdistance all their rivals by their ability to attract to them the multimillionaire collectors whose patronage is essential if you are to do business on a magnificent scale. Rosenbach's bitterest enemy in the trade will be forced to admit that the secret of his huge success is due largely to the fact that he has not only learned to know rare books and manuscripts, as few other men have known them, but that he is also capable of loving them for themselves, with somewhat the same sort of passion that possesses the rank and file of bibliomaniacs. Rosenbach was raised among rare books by an uncle who bought and sold them and who also loved them. It might be said that this was all that was necessary to engender the instinct. So it may often occur, where only the commercial flair is involved. Yet how rarely does it happen in the families of collectors who collect purely as a hobby? The ripe flower of genius is rarely transmitted from father to son, and the same is generally true in the matter of full-blown hobbies. Book collectors in the second generation are astonishingly infrequent, in the third generation practically unknown. I heard one young man, still in the sophomoric stage, refer to his father's strange bug, and add this commentary in the American vernacular. If it were not for the fact that the old man is rolling in Jack, the family would probably call in a squad of those mind cure babies who take the old bean apart and put it together again. He's welcome so far as the rest of us are concerned to donate his rubbish to some college library. From one selfish viewpoint, the beginning book collector should rejoice in the fact that book collecting is pretty generally a one-generation hobby. The more libraries given away to public institutions are locked up in foundations, the fewer the rarities that are likely to come into the market. The dealers never miss an opportunity to hammer this into your consciousness. Indeed, it is their pet persuasion to bring you to the point of paying 10 times as much for a book as it brought at auction a few years since. And usually, you swallow the bait because it tickles your palate going down. From then on, you watch the newspapers with a greedy eye for some new report of a great collector's benefactions. Somehow they are not so frequent as you could wish. There are woefully few Lennoxes, Morgans, Whites, Huntingtons, and Folders, and most all of them have a habit of living to a great old age. It is the multiplication of new collectors, the amazing annual crop of new millionaires in the United States of America, on which you must rely for the maintenance of high prices. Likewise, it will bring you a bit of shock to go through the sales catalogues from the Anderson Galleries and Sotheby's for a given year, and discover how many collections are being sold by heirs and trustees of estates. For every collection I know of that is now destined to be donated to some public institution, there are at least 5 whose owners inform me that they are to be sold at public auction after they pass on. You may not think these observations have much bearing on the general subject of forming the book collecting habit. They have to this extent. As the insidious passion for rare books grips you tighter, the tighter in its coils you are compelled to give thought to what it is all about. Are you devoting all this time and money to the satisfaction of a purely selfish craving, like a yearning for strong drink? Is it the miser's instinct of hoarding that you seek to justify by declaring that you are preserving these relics for posterity? How can you, Felix Jones, preserve them any better than they were preserved by Willie Smith, who sold them to dealer A, who sold them to dealer B, who sold them to dealer X, who sold them to you? The fact that they have been splendidly preserved for 2 or 3 or 4 centuries reduces such an argument to rank sophistry. If your sole answer to these questions is, I collect because I collect, then your hobby is at least a little brother to a vice, and you might as well be sufficiently frank to confess the same. Your one defense then is that it is a harmless vice. By your extravagance in buying books, you are not depriving your offspring of proper nourishment, clothing, shelter, and education. You are not causing your wife to go without the luxuries that her social position demands. You provide cars enough to supply the wants of all the family. You keep up your life insurance, maintain a safe balance at your bankers, only after all these needs are taken care of. Do you portion out your surplus income to a horde of happy dealers? But what about your charities? Instead of splurging on books, why not devote this surplus to good causes? Are there not innumerable seekers of funds for the churches, for hospitals, for anti-salon leagues, anti-tobacco leagues, anti-this, that, and other leagues, who come to you in vain? Think of the number of hospital beds you might endow with the money squandered on one edito precepts of Chapman's Homer. Think of the regiments of little orphans you could make happy with new wristwatches and stamp collections by a gift of those thousands of dollars you contemplate paying for an almost unblemished first of Poe's Al Araf, or a somewhat battered first of Keats' Lamia. If none of these speculations pricks your conscience, then you must certainly admit that you are numbered among the vivaciously selfish of mankind. Your only way out is to get a brand new set of harness for your hobby and ride him down a straight and narrow path according to some plan that you can justify in the sight of all men. And so concludes that chapter on how collectors happen. And the 3rd chapter is where Currie gets into how to go about collecting. There is the happy-go collecting, there is the single author collecting, there is collecting by list, and then there is the, I don't know that he particularly gives a name to it, but there's sort of the haphazard author list, perhaps we call it the rabbit hole style of collecting. So I hope you enjoyed that chapter. If you did, if you made it this far, 44 minutes into the video, let me know if you are interested in having me continue on with reading chapters from this book. I hope that you enjoyed.